Appreciate you guys showing up. Thank you for showing up Wednesday nights, late night at the Lege. I'm doing this every Wednesday night. We appreciate you guys showing up every Wednesday night. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you're coming in from LinkedIn, thank you, thank you. If you're coming in from Instagram, I want to say thank you. If you're coming in from Facebook, I want to say thank you. If you are familiar with me from some of the work I've done, I want to say thank you for showing up and sharing out. Definitely want to give a shout out to Equally Yoked Marketing for sponsoring this video, as well as Reform. If you will go over to eymac.org, you'll see a tab. Now, this is for folks who are directly impacted by parole and probation. You know, we're working with Reform to reduce the impact of technical violations and incarceration as a result of those violations. So if you've been impacted and you're on or have been on community supervision, please, there's a form or a survey that you can fill out. So head over to there. Just want to say thank you to all you folks for showing up every Wednesday, 10 p.m. Text me if you want to get some of the, we're sharing tips and tricks to folks who are really, really interested in trying to get their weight up and their knowledge up in terms of what they can do to affect the process. I hope I haven't been on mute this whole time. Well, I guess not good. So text me so I can get you on the email list, and you can get some of the tips that I share with folks who are really serious about this work. You know, I do this for everyone, but, you know, I spend some extra time with people who are really interested in trying to get involved, because I know when I was trying to get involved, I didn't have anybody. Like, I didn't have anybody who had been, first of all, had been to prison, right? Second of all, who was willing to explain the process. So I'm sharing my phone number for you to send me your email, and I'll text you tips and tricks that I share with folks that's trying to really, really be about this work, right? So again, thank you for showing up. Funny story. Y'all know I'm from Texas, right? And in Texas, football is a big deal. If you don't, I mean, Friday Night Lights should tell you how big of a deal football is in Texas. And when I went to high school, I lived next door to the head coach. And I had been living next door to the head coach since I was a little kid. So I got to tell you how long I had been groomed to play football. Well, what happened in between is that I got turned on to music, and I chose to be in a band or be in band at high school as opposed to playing football. I played them both for a bit, but I just finally said 2 days, man, y'all can have this 2 days. I'll just stay in band practice, right? Well, the reason why I tell that story is because I'm going to talk about sports tonight, and the people who know me know that I don't really watch sports at all. Matter of fact, the last time I watched sports seriously was when the Knicks was playing the Rockets and the OJ chase. I was in prison. I was down there in Brownsville, Texas. It was hot. There was, we were on this brand new unit called Garza East, and Garza East had just been built. I'm talking about, it was so hot that you were sweating coming in the shower and out the shower. And I remember them stopping the game for this OJ chase, and I just never really went back to sports. And the reason why I talk about that is because tonight I'm going to use some sports analogies, and to the people that know me, it's going to be like, man, you don't watch sports like that. But trust me, I used to have an interest in sports at one time. So anyway, let's talk about what we're going to talk about. First of all, let's kind of dial back to last week. Last week, we talked about what is legislative advocacy. We kind of laid that out, right? You know, we talked about, you know, sometimes it's introducing a bill. Sometimes it's talking to a lawmaker. Sometimes it's being involved in the actual process. We also talked about where you fit in, right? And so you can go back on this same page to find a video from last week watch the video, and that'll kind of catch you up to while we're talking about what I'm talking about this week. Now, again, you can get notified of when we're going live by texting me, and I'll email you and add you to our follow list, and we'll make sure that you get on our newsletter list as well. We're going to be doing the Advocacy newsletter as well. All right, so one of the ways that, I got involved is the result of my direct experience, right? And so tonight, I want to talk about, not only advocacy, but the process, right? And the process is really what's important when I think about how I got involved, right? Because, as I tell people, when I came out of prison, I didn't know anything about organizing. I didn't know anything about being an advocate. I didn't know anything about being a lawmaker. But as I engaged, I realized what I lacked was knowledge. And the more knowledge I had, the more I was able to insert myself in rooms. And us folks who are directly impacted, we have an imposter syndrome where we're afraid to inject I won't say we're afraid. Sometimes we're hesitant to inject ourselves into the conversation because we don't lack the education or we don't lack the certification. So what got me comfortable in moving, what got me comfortable in being able to, talk how I talk, is that I went through some things, but I also, and I'm saying this from a place of being humble, but I'm also saying this as a place of why you should listen to me. Every legislative fight that I have led, I've won, right? And so when you're thinking about people that are telling you something, have they done what they're telling you how to do? And so the things that I'm telling you how to do, we won, or, in some cases I won. But most importantly, the information that you're getting is coming from a place of, I've done this before. This ain't no theory. This isn't some kind of course about, what I think you should do. This is how I was able to be effective as someone that did not have the education, as someone that did not have the experience, and as someone who had never been engaged in politics in a day of my life. Now, my parents were involved. So I was always kind of, centered around social justice, but not like this, all right? So there's three ways to get engaged in the process. You can be an organizer, you can be an advocate, or you can be a lawmaker. Now, the fourth way, people often ask me, what's the difference between being an organizer and an advocate? Well, I think what's more important is what's the difference between being an organizer, advocate, and a lobbyist? Normally, it's coming down to pay, right? And who's paying you and why they're paying you. So the fourth kind of way to engage in this process is to be a lobbyist. Now, that's another subject, but I'm going to, I'm going to encourage people who are directly impacted. Don't be afraid to engage. Don't be afraid to maybe consider that as a path, as a career path, right? Because lobbyists are just those who are very educated about the legislative process. They have relationships, but they also have an agenda. And sometimes, directly impacted folks need agendas, right? Or folks who will fight for those agendas. So legislative advocacy and ways to engage, builds on what we talked about last week. But the reason why I'm bringing up sports, and the reason, well, happy birthday to Kobe, for one. And what makes me think about Kobe is Phil Jackson and the triangle. The triangle, no matter where Phil Jackson took the triangle, it was effective. And the reason why it was effective is because it demanded that the players were masters of the basics. So no matter where they played, the triangle worked, but you had to master the basics. So I'm going to be really redundant. I'm going to be kind of pedantic about the basics, about the legislative process, because once you're comfortable and confident about the basics and the process, when you're talking, you have the confidence to go in there and ask for what you want because you know the process to get it. So I'm going to be very, very, I'm going to foot stomp process, and I'm going to foot stomp the basics. And I'm going to go back to those 1,000 free throws that Kobe shot after the game when they lost to Mike, right? I'm going to go back to those 1,000 jump shots that Mike shot after they lost, right? And I'm going to go back to how many times I stayed up and read about the legislative process when I first started engaging this, because people made me feel like an idiot when I first stepped in the room. When I first came into those organizing rooms and we were talking about the legislative process, people made me feel like an idiot. So, I'm just telling you. But so you can arm yourself, I'm going to show you how to carry a dead body, right? I'm going to show you how to respond when your gun is jammed. So when you go into these rooms as somebody directly impacted, when you go into these rooms as somebody that doesn't have the education, they're going to talk to you and they're going to talk around you. So I'm going to give you the information that you need to be able to fit into these conversations. All right, you ready? Let's get to it. So when I talk about the legislative process, one of the easiest ways to talk about it is going back to Schoolhouse Rock. Now, if you're not old enough to know about Schoolhouse Rock, I want you to go to YouTube and I want you to type in, "I'm just a bill." All right. Now, when I first started organizing and people were doing these all-day trainings on organizing, had they just played this video, it would have done a lot more help than all the talking that they were doing, right? So go watch that video. And I'm saying it, I'm not being glib, I'm being serious. That "I'm just a bill" is what allowed me to really learn the process. So when people were talking about different sequences of the bill, I was able to follow along, right? Now, when you go watch that video, you're gonna see that there's an introduction of the bill. And we talked about that one of those ways it involved is introducing the bill. But once the bill has been introduced, it's either going to the House or it's going to the Senate. In theory, both of those processes are the same. In actuality, they're a little different because the House has rules and the Senate has rules. This is on a congressional level, this is on a state level. And it gets even more contoured and textured when you talk about different states, right? Particularly with states that have a short session, right? Those states that have there's some states that have a 30-day session. There are some states that have a 180-day session. In those states, you really have to know the process if you're going to be effective. So you got to know in the House what committee it's likely going to be assigned to. In the Senate, it's the same thing. But before you do that, you got to have a sponsor. Well, you don't have to have a sponsor, but it's very helpful. Now, I will give you a pro tip and a hack. When you're talking about this process and you're thinking about, well, should we introduce the bill to the House or the Senate? Both. Because the other side, when they're trying to fight you, they're going to put a bill through the House and the Senate, because that makes you have to work extra hard. Well, same difference. When you're talking about introducing a bill, you want to work the House and you want to work the Senate at the same time. So if one of them stalls, the other one still has some traction, right? Now, going back to the sponsor bit, your sponsor should be someone who's well educated on your issue so they can have some kind of buy-in. So when they talk about it, they're not just reiterating something that you have told them. And so that means it's really helpful to get to know their staff. So their staff will be able to, massage your language into something that that lawmaker can talk about publicly, right? And that goes into bill language. With the bill language, there is a necessity for us to be involved in that process. And it can get wonky because oftentimes you're talking about amending the Constitution, and that language is it's written in a legalese form, but even more so, it's written in a legislative form. And, shalls and may makes a difference, whereas makes a difference. And you have to be kind of cognizant of the way those variables play out in policy. You don't have to be a policy expert because there's plenty of lawyers that's going to be in the room that is willing to read through that policy line by line. But you as an organizer, you need to orient yourself to being able to read the policy, being able to point out which parts of that legislation that's going to be harmful, which parts of that legislation is going to be helpful, because you're going to have to communicate the impact of that legislation to the community. Assuming that you're an organizer, assuming that you're an advocate, and you're bringing in the desires and the needs of the community as well. So when you're talking to the lawmaker, you're talking to their staff, you're talking to general counsel, you're talking to the folks that's going to draft the language of the bill, you have to be able to line by line be able to pinpoint which provisions of this bill is going to be harmful or helpful, and talk about those things in a substantive way. All right, now, once that bill is written, it's going to get assigned to a committee. When the bill is assigned to the committee and your sponsor lays out the bill, that's the first reading. Now, there may or may not be a vote then. It depends on how much power your sponsor has. It would be helpful to get a committee chairman to sponsor the bill, so you can have an immediate vote. And that's like a temperature check. That's gonna tell you how long is this bill what is the likelihood of this bill getting through the process, and if it's gonna get stalled out. If your bill gets stalled out in the committee, you can hang it up. I'm letting you know now. If the first reading comes to, still pending in committee, you're going to have to work the other bill. And that's why I tell you, you're going to have to introduce bills in both chambers, because you may not have the kind of support in committee that you need to get beyond that first reading. Now, assuming you get beyond that first reading, you're going to have a second reading once to get it out of the committee, right? Or to get it onto the floor. Now, once it's been introduced to the floor, more often than not, you're going to have amendments. More often than not, you're going to have to, go back into committee, or hopefully it came out of committee with the amendments. If not, those amendments are probably going to be part of that floor vote, and that's the third reading. Now, the third reading in that chamber is what gets it to the next house. So just like you heard Nancy Pelosi talking about the bill passed the House, the John Lewis voting rights bill passed the House, but it's going to probably get hung up in the Senate, or it's going to get hung up in a committee, or it's going to get hung up on the floor vote because somebody wants to amend the original language that was passed out of the House. The more you know about this, the more you educate yourself, the more you kind of, are aware of the process, then you know not to get disappointed if it doesn't get a floor vote. And you also know how to talk about it publicly once it's made a certain stage, right? So once it's gotten voted out of committee, that doesn't mean the bill is passed. Once it's gotten a floor vote, that doesn't mean the bill is passed. Once it's gotten out of that chamber and into the next chamber, that doesn't mean the bill is passed. The bill isn't passed until it's gotten out of both chambers. And it still hasn't become a law until the governor signs it or the president signs it, right? So once you know these processes, you know how to talk about it. And that's going to be very important as you disseminate the information to your audience, to your base. There's the activists and organizers, people who are directly impacted, engaged in the process. All right. So as there's a state legislative process, a lot of folks like me get involved on a municipal level. That means you start trying to pass bills on, a city level. That's how I got started. And we got started with what's called Cite and Release, which was a trickle-down campaign that the ACLU had started. And I was an organizer at grassroots. We took on Cite and Release as a way to stop the impact of SB4, which is an immigration bill. But also, there was so much talk around marijuana should be decriminalized. The folks who are most impacted by marijuana arrests were Black folks. So Cite and Release was a municipal campaign. And the reason why because I want to take you through a municipal campaign, a House bill and a Senate bill to kind of give you some orientation, right? And I will provide these. If you leave a comment and say that you want the slide deck, I'll leave it. So following the passage of SB4, we decided, and I say we, advocates and different organizations figured out that the best way for us to fight what they were doing at the Lege was to pass something local, right? So in June 2018, the city council took on 2 resolutions. And resolutions or ordinances is the language you use when you're talking about a municipal effort. When you're talking about a state effort, we usually use the language of an act, or we'll say a bill. But if you say legislative process, as you're talking about the municipal process, it's really the same because it's still a piece of legislation. It's just a piece of municipal legislation. Now, process and basics. The introduction is kind of the same as it is on the state process, where you're going to get a champion, and that champion is going to introduce this idea of the dais. And then the dais is going to have a chance to buy in or amend it. And it usually shows up in the form of, again, resolutions or ordinances. Now, when I first began to talk about why you should be engaged, is because your engagement determines what the outcome is being sought, or what outcome is being sought. In some cases, depending on who the sponsor is, they don't care about the impact on the community. They care about the cost benefit. How much money is it going to save? And you have to be prepared to negotiate around that, and you have to be prepared to kind of ideate in a way that allows you to align your goals and objectives with their goals and objectives. So in this case, it was to reduce the amount of arrests and offenses for low-level arrests. But understand that those goals are part of a larger goal too, which we were attacking the police contract. We were building a runway to launch a police contractual a campaign against the union. And this is one of the ways we were using to kind of pick away at that. So if you take that idea to a larger scale, and if in your state you're trying to pass a fair chance or a reentry bill or a parole or probation bill, on the local level, you may want to pass a fair chance hiring bill, which will allow you to engage employers. It allows you to engage the parole and probation board, but it also begins to set the stage for the state work that you're trying to do or the local work that you're trying to do, right? So those policies, as I was just explaining, were definitely aimed at reducing the amount of contact people have with cops. Because we felt if we reduce the amount of contact people have with cops, then you're automatically reducing the amount of arrests, which means you're having a significant impact on mass incarceration. So though it was a local effort, there was a broader goal and there was an overarching goal. And when you don't have to do it this way, but when you're thinking about introducing a piece of legislation, it shouldn't be in the moment. You should be thinking 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road. So the first piece may be a municipal case, a municipal ordinance. The second piece may be a legislative piece, and you may have to try it in the House. You may have to try it in the Senate. And then it may be a federal piece of legislation that you're trying to pass. But I'll warn you, federal legislation has less impact on your life than state and local does. All right. Now, I'll share this with you, but as you see, we were concentrating on very minor arrests because those were the bulk of the arrests. And we felt like the more pervasive of the issue, the more people we were able to impact. Now, what you're going to deal with is carve-outs. I'm going to use that language now so you get used to hearing it. You're going to talk, when people are talking about passing a piece of legislation, you're going to always run up against carve-outs. And what that means is there's a certain population that people refuse to give a break. There's a certain population that people refuse to legislate on behalf for. When I say refuse, because at the first instance, when it comes to removing these people from the bill, they take it. And normally it's folks who are convicted of a violent crime. It's folks who are convicted of a sexual-related crime. And it's folks who are convicted of using a weapon of some sort. And the reason why I say that is, as if you look at what we were fighting against, none of those issues are really violent crime associated or violent associated. And that's because we knew if we included anything that had to do with someone being hurt, the possibility of it passing was nil. Now, again, there are different theories about long-term work and short-term work, incremental work or transformational work. You have to decide which level, which framework you're going to operate in, which wheelhouse is good for you. Because if you're working for an organization, your personal wheelhouse may not align with their wheelhouse. So you may be looking at doing transformational work, and they may be looking at doing work that's going to put points on the board right now. And you have to be fluid enough and flexible enough in your thinking and knowing the process to like say, okay, if they want some short-term work, that means we got to pass something in this city, in this state to move this thing, right? Now, as you may have heard me talk about in some of the earlier videos, I talked about power mapping. I talked about tactics and I talked about strategy. So go back to those earlier videos to kind of reorient yourself on as to why the mayor, the city council, and the Austin Police were our targets. Direct actions, immediate testimony. Go back to that and I'll explain the tactics. But basically, when you're with any kind of campaign, you have to have targets. And those targets, you know, just like with I'm from Texas. So if you're aiming at a deer, you have to have a line of sight at that deer. You have to have a way to hit that deer without any obstacles. Well, same thing. And the tactic, the pulling back of the bow or the lining up of the sight, those are your tactics. Now, the strategy is how you get that deer in your sight. Same difference, right? We call it a pathway to victory. So just taking you through the municipal process, because I want to do a case study on the legislative process, the state process, but I think it's important for us to know that at whatever level you are, you can engage, but you got to arm yourself with information. And that's why I'm doing this. All right. So again, if you want this deck, I will include it, but you got to put it in the comments. Now, the reason why I talked about long-term vision, because even after these ordinances were passed, there was still a high arrest rate among Black folks. Cops were still arresting folks based upon what they look like, or what their cars smell like, or what they may possibly be doing. So even though you may pass a piece of legislation, that doesn't always mean it's going to have an immediate impact. And you have to be prepared for that. And that's why I say, depending on where you're engaging at, will determine your level of your pain threshold. Because even when you win, you may not win, right? Another case study that goes into a municipal study is the fair chance hiring. When there was a coalition of former incarcerated folks that decided to try to pass the fair chance hiring ordinance, that process was the result of us being directly impacted by not finding employment. So whatever that issue that is driving you to advocacy will determine your threshold to handle a loss or a win, or how to advance that loss or win. All right, so the House legislative campaign came as a result of us passing a fair chance hiring ordinance. And that hiring ordinance was spearheaded by a city council member who engaged his community outreach director, who engaged us as former incarcerated folks. And funny thing about it is, the group that I was part of, I came into the group to sell my book because I had, well, no, I'm lying to you. I came into the group to launch my speaking career, and I had written a book as a way to launch my speaking career. And that's literally how I was in the room and got engaged. I had no clue that we were, going to initially be called in to help pass a piece of legislation. So one of the words I want to introduce you to is preemption. Preemption means there's a higher legislative body looking to control what a lower body is doing. So oftentimes, just recently, you saw how Biden was going to use the education department to curtail the powers of the governor, right? Well, in this instance, the legislator from Austin was going to attempt to stop any other city in Texas from passing a fair chance hiring ordinance. Now, I didn't anticipate this. I thought once we passed the ordinance that that's what that is. Now, again, as I told you at the outset, I'm going to teach you how to carry a dead body and respond to a jammed gun. And the reason why I use that analogy is because when you're going to war, the last thing that you're expecting to have to do is carry the body of your buddy that you showed up with, nor are you anticipating your gun is on a jam. Well, we were not anticipating winning and having to go fight at the ledge that none of us had experience at, right? And that fight, in Texas, it was amazing because the legislator who attacked us wasn't like a rookie. He wasn't somebody that didn't have any power. He knew what he was doing, and he was backed by some powerful entities. And when you're thinking about your issue or your bill or your law, do not get caught up on the moral side of it or what you think is right. You got to think about that there are people that have other interests than right or wrong, right? Now, the fight to keep fair chance hiring was a municipal fight that morphed itself into a state fight, but it helped us learn the state legislative process. That's where I learned how to go into those offices and talk to the general counsel. I learned how to talk to the legislative directors, but most importantly, I learned the power of talking to the person that answers the phone when you go into that lawmaker's office and sitting down at that desk and having a conversation with the person that answers the phone. I really never talked to a lot of lawmakers because I felt like that was a waste of time. They're going to tell me what they think I want to hear. But if I was able to touch the hearts and minds of the staff, then I was going to get to the lawmaker. That's just a little pro tip. You can do what you want to. Now, when it comes to passing a law or a piece of legislation, you're going to have some help. That means you're going to build a coalition. We call those stakeholders. Those stakeholders, depending on the issue, depending on the bill, depending on the state, the configuration of that coalition differs. But just to give you some perspective, in this case, I have it listed, but the stakeholders were the folks who were kind of impacted or champions of the Austin bill. The policy, because it was impacting private employers' way of screening employees, it became more of just an employment issue. It became, does the government have a right to determine how a business runs its business? Became kind of the wedge. So, experience versus expertise. As I told you, when you come in the room and you're directly impacted and you're fresh out of prison, or you didn't have to be fresh out of prison. I was fresh out of being a strip club DJ. People are not going to talk to you in an inclusive way. They're not going to tell you what they mean by preemption. They're not going to tell you what they mean by a first reading. They're not going to tell you what they mean by a floor vote. Right? So you got to educate yourself. You got to get your basics down. So when you go in these rooms, you know what you're talking about. Experience versus expertise. So when you're able to layer your experience on your expertise, you become a more powerful advocate, a more powerful organizer, and it allows you a way to move differently than folks with only expertise, right? Impacted leadership. That was the most, for me, that was the most important part of passing this or stopping that bill from passing, was we were able to be led by folks that were directly impacted by the bill. You can take on equality rights, you can take on voting rights, you can take on immigration rights, you can take on climate change. The reason why those water protectors are so powerful when it comes to moving legislation is because those folks are impacted when that water is damaged by oil or by drilling or by running a pipeline through their homeland. Well, same thing. We were directly impacted by you trying to end folks having access to employment. But there was a broader scope too. That being, businesses are not, right now, businesses are suffering because they're not hiring formerly incarcerated people. Right now, businesses are saying, that they can't find employees. It's because they're not looking for them, or their city or state disallows them to give people a fair chance. So, it was impacted leadership. The narrative. Narrative is going to help you win that strategy, and the narrative is what carries the bill when you're talking about it, whether it be in the House or the Senate. Now, in this particular instance, this was a House bill that was introduced in the House and it was us stopping this as opposed to us introducing this. And oftentimes you're going to find yourself on the defensive side of the ball. So you got to learn how to play defense. Knowing how to get points on the board is good, but knowing how to stop them folks is good too, because the best offense is the defense. I'm sorry, some folks ain't gonna agree, but I'm being real. Having goals at the beginning, because they introduced the bill in the House and they introduced the bill in the Senate. So we were forced to work both tracks. And oftentimes you're not going to have relationships in the House and the Senate, and the Senate can move in such a way that you can't stop it if you don't know the process or if you don't have relationships. We had relationships in the House, and we were able to use some tactics to slow it down. I'm not going to share those with you because y'all ain't the only ones listening, but timeline is important. When you're thinking about the viability of your campaign, when you think about the pathway of victory, you got to think about the timeline. And as I said, some sessions are short, 30 days. Some sessions are long, year and a half, right? Maybe not that long, probably about 90 days. I think some run as long as 60 days. So some of the tactics, press conferences, press releases, lobby day, those are ways that you as an advocate, you as an organizer, you as an activist can be involved, right? And I want to be mindful and transparent here. When I worked this campaign, I was volunteering. I was working 14, 15-hour days without pay. So I didn't even know that people were getting paid to do this work. So I don't want you to come into this thing saying, well, I can't do it because I'm not getting paid. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I got involved was because I couldn't get employment. And if this was a way to help me get employment and I had to do it for free, well, it's the same thing. And that determines, again, what role do you play? And we'll talk about that at the end, right? But let's get through this. What happens when you win? So we were able to stop the bill, and we did not think about the implementation of the Austin ordinance because we were too busy trying to stop the bill. And because we weren't thinking about the implementation of the ordinance ended up not being implemented. And right now, just to bring you up to date on this effort, there's an attack on the ordinance again, because we weren't able to stop the permanent attack by putting the language in the bill that would have cemented it into the Texas Constitution, right? So, as I said, that was a version of a municipal campaign, that was a version of a House campaign, and kind of going back to what we talked about originally, and I want to foot stomp this, 3 ways to engage in the process: as an organizer, as an advocate, or as a lawmaker. Those 3 ways, that's up to you. Well, because I engaged as an organizer and then I engaged as an advocate, I ended up engaging as a lawmaker or an attempted lawmaker. So when I ran for office, me running for office came as a result of me leading the effort to stop HB 577. When I ran for office, I ran on a platform of participatory democracy. And I really believe that people should be involved in the process as much as possible. I don't think the legislative process should be some kind of enigma. I don't think you should have to have an education. They should be able to read, of course. I don't think you should have to, and the only reason why I think you should have to read is because you have to understand the language. I don't want you to think that there's a barrier if you can't read, because plenty of folks that help impact legislation couldn't read. Fannie Mae Hamer, comes to mind. Anyway, when I ran for office, I challenged a state law, which was part of the election code. And when I ran, I didn't realize I was challenging state law. But because I was familiar, in prison, I wrote my first motion on a piece of toilet paper in prison. So I was familiar with, statutory codes. I was familiar with laws, familiar with case. I was familiar with the language. And when I read the language of the code, I was like, well, it doesn't say I can't run. It just says that I've had to resolve the disabilities of my conviction. And that's different, because then you have to define disabilities. What disabilities are you referring to? I was on parole. I'm not on parole. I couldn't vote. Now I can vote. And if you're talking about social disabilities, well, that's not a legal standing. And so what ended up happening is, because Austin allowed me to run, there was a senator in Houston that decided that, we're not gonna let that happen again. And he introduced a bill, SB 466, in the Senate, because he knew at that time I had relationships in the House, because we were able to stop over 76 Republicans, if not more. I think it was more than that, who had signed on to HB 577. So the senator knew that I was effective in the House at stopping bills, so he chose the Senate. And that's why I'm telling you, you have to know both sides of the process. It just so happens that I had been involved in closing some prisons. So I was familiar with the Senate budget process. I was familiar with some of the senators. I had already gone and done some lobbying in those offices. Now I got to tell you, it's a different ballgame in the Senate. It's a different ballgame, just different. They make their own rules, they change the rules, all of that. It's crazy. However, basically what we did is we launched a campaign to stop this bill. When I say we, I'm talking about me and my wife. My wife and I basically were the lead on this campaign, and we were able to pull in some organizations and some outliers to come in and testify and work the bill in the process. So what ended up happening is, when I ran, again, there was some legal ambiguity to my ability to run. I was able to present a challenge to that the city clerk bought, which she should have, because it was based on the Constitution. And my argument was, if I'm allowed to run for president, if I'm allowed to run for Congress, well, by God, I'm allowed to run for city council. Try to stop me. And that's the kind of approach we took. Ultimately, we were placed on the ballot. Now, that was in November 2018. January 2019, SB 466 was filed. And in the introduction language of the bill, you can go and Google it now, you'll see that he used my name. He said the reason why he's filing this bill is because Austin allowed me to run. And it got through its first reading. So that meant it already had a head of steam. It made it out of committee. You understand that? The thing about it was, when it made it out of committee, it had to go, if for whatever reason, there were two committees that it ended up in, right? But the first committee, the State Affairs, you see, you got 8 votes, 1 nay, but we were able to stop it in the Elections Committee. And that's why I tell you it's important for you to know the process, all right? So what role do you play? It's up to you. As I told you, for fair chance hiring, I got involved because I came out the strip club and I couldn't find work. I got involved with cite and release because I was a grassroots organizer. Being an organizer led me to running for office. So running for office is what now allows me to be a consultant. So depending on where you want to insert yourself determines what role you want to play? You know, how important is the issue to you? How much time are you willing to commit? I won't say sacrifice, because it's not a sacrifice, it's a commitment. And is that effort winnable? You know, everything I've talked about tonight, you know, we weren't able to push forward something beyond, you know, a qualitative win, but we were able to stop something. So when you're engaging in something, that's what encouraged me to keep going, is because every effort that I led, I was able to win. And that's what happens when you're directly impacted, because you lead a different way. Your passion comes from a different place. You know, the people who were involved in that fair chance hiring fight, there was a lot of lawyers, there were a lot of organizations, but none of those folks had spent 7 years wanting to just get a job at McDonald's, and McDonald's wouldn't hire you as a janitor. So their reasoning for wanting this piece of legislation passed was a little different, and they couldn't talk about it in the same way. All right. So every week, Wednesday night, we're giving out knowledge. Knowledge is the new power. This is where you come and get it. The only way you can be effective is to, you know, be informed. And you know, I still believe in people power. It's still we over me. And I believe that the more, you know, when I talk about being a lawmaker, I may bring on a friend, you know, because there may be some interest in folks trying to run for office. So, you know, at some point we'll talk about that too, right? So maybe I'll have her on and we'll talk about, you know, what it means for someone from incarcerated to run for office, all right? But as I told you, the basics, right? We're gonna shoot free throws, we're gonna shoot jump shots, we're gonna do passing drills, you know, we're gonna run sprints, we're gonna do the basics. Once we get the basics down, then we'll start playing above the rim. All right, LewisConwayJr.com, everything, Lewis Conway Jr. social media. Send me a text, email, put something in the comments. If I missed something, as I told you, I haven't figured out the Facebook thing yet. You know, trying to communicate and talk at the same time. I just ain't figured that out yet. But if y'all are interested, I may send out a Zoom link so we can interact on Zoom. But we'll figure it out. All right, appreciate y'all doing it. Wednesday nights, 10 p.m. Y'all come hang out with me. Have a good one.